The whisper of King Henry VIII into Norris's ear during their horse ride cut deeper than any executioner's axe ever could. The king made a cold offer. Just admit to sleeping with Queen Anne Boleyn, and you get to keep your life. It was a dirty lie in exchange for breath, but Norris did the unthinkable and refused that mercy. He chose to let his own blood soak the wooden block, rather than utter a single false word to stain the Queen's honor. It is terrifying to think that the man being dragged to the scaffold was the only one allowed to see the king at his most naked and vulnerable. Norris was the groom of the Stool, a friend so close he attended to the king's most private bathroom needs and washed him like a brother every morning. From holding the keys to the king's private chambers to facing the executioner, his death proved a brutal truth. A lifetime of loyalty meant nothing the moment the king demanded blood. He came from the gentry, the solid, reliable backbone of England. Born sometime in the late 1480s, records are frustratingly opaque, but 1482 is a likely candidate. Norris was the product of a family that had mastered the art of survival. His father was Sir Edward Norris of Yattenden, and his mother was Friedesweide Lovell. These names carry weight. The Norrises were a Berkshire family with a history of military service and administrative competence, but the real lesson of his childhood was political agility. The late 15th century in England was a bloodbath, the Wars of the Roses. It was a time when choosing the wrong side meant death, and the right side changed with the wind. The Norris family had navigated these treacherous waters with remarkable skill. They had served the Yorkist kings when the White Rose was in ascendance, but they had seamlessly transitioned to the Tudors when Henry VII took the crown at Bosworth Field. This adaptability was in Henry Norris's DNA. He was raised with the understanding that loyalty was the currency of survival, but that loyalty had to be directed toward the person currently wearing the crown. He was not born to lead armies, but to manage men. He was not born to rule, but to serve. Yet there was an ambition in the Norris bloodline. They were new men, part of a rising class that the Tudor dynasty preferred over the old quarrelsome nobility. The Tudors didn't trust the old dukes with their private armies and royal bloodlines. They wanted men like Norris, capable, dependent on the king for their status, and therefore theoretically unshakable in their loyalty. Young Henry Norris was sent to court at an early age to complete his education. The court of Henry VII, the old king, was a somber, miserly place, ruled by suspicion and accounting books. But when that old king died in 1509, and the 17-year-old Henry VIII ascended the throne, the world exploded into color. Suddenly, the court was no longer a place of whispers and ledgers. It was a perpetual party. It was a playground for the young, the beautiful, and the athletic. And Henry Norris, though slightly older than the new king, was perfectly positioned to thrive in this new ecosystem. We often picture Henry VIII as the Holbein portrait, a massive, terrifying, obesity-stricken tyrant with small, cruel eyes. But that is the Henry of the end. The Henry that Norris knew, the Henry that Norris loved, was a golden god. In the 1510s and 1520s, Henry VIII was arguably the most handsome prince in Christendom. He stood 6 feet 2 inches tall, with a wrestler's build, reddish gold hair, and boundless energy. He was an intellectual, a musician, a theologian, and above all, an athlete. He was obsessed with jousting, hunting, tennis, and wrestling. To survive in this king's inner circle, you had to be more than just a bureaucrat. You had to be a minion. The minions were the king's favorites. They were a fraternity of young men who lived with the king, rode with him, gambled with him, and fought alongside him in the mock warfare of the tilt yard. They were the jocks of the Tudor era. Norris fit this mold perfectly, but with a crucial distinction. while other minions, like the reckless Francis Bryan or the haughty Charles Brandon, were known for their wild behavior, drinking and womanizing, Norris cultivated an air of quiet competence. He was the adult in the room. He was an excellent jouster, which was essential. Jousting was not just a sport, it was the primary way a man demonstrated his courage and martial skill to the king. To ride against the king in the lists, to lower a lance and charge at a galloping monarch, required nerves of steel and immense physical control. You had to provide a challenge, but you dared not injure the king. Norris mastered this delicate dance. By 1515, Norris was already accumulating responsibilities. He was appointed keeper of the park at Folly John. By 1518, he was a gentleman of the Privy Chamber, but his true ascension began in 1526 with the Eltham Ordinances. This was a massive restructuring of the royal household, orchestrated by Cardinal Wolsey. Wolsey, jealous of the influence the minions had over the king, tried to purge the Privy Chamber of the wilder, more chaotic elements. He sent many of the king's drinking buddies away, but Wolsey kept Henry Norris. Why? Because Norris was indispensable. Even the jealous cardinal recognized that Norris was steady, discreet, and efficiently managed the king's moods. In the vacuum left by the purged minions, Henry Norris stepped up to become the undisputed head of the Privy Chamber. He became the Groom of the Stool. To fully grasp why Sir Henry Norris was the most dangerous man in England to his enemies, and why his eventual fall was so necessary for Thomas Cromwell, we must move beyond titles and look at architecture. The Tudor court was not just a hierarchy of people, it was a hierarchy of rooms. In the 1530s, the royal palaces, Greenwich, Hampton Court, Whitehall, were designed like onions. The outer layers were public, chaotic, and noisy. The Great Hall was open to almost anyone with a decent coat. The Great Watching Chamber was for the guards and lower courtiers. The Presence Chamber was for the nobility to wait in hope of seeing the king processing to chapel. But at the center of this onion was the Privy Chamber. This was the Sanctum Sanctorum. It was a suite of rooms protected by heavy oak doors and guarded by fierce ushers. No one, not the Lord Chancellor, not the Archbishop of Canterbury, not even the Queen herself could enter these rooms without permission. Sir Henry Norris lived in these rooms. He slept on a pallet at the foot of the king's bed or in a small antechamber immediately adjacent. While the rest of the court was miles away, metaphorically, in the outer halls, Norris was breathing the same air as the monarch. The layout of these rooms was designed for intimacy. There was the bedchamber, where the king slept. There was the breakfast room, and there was the secret jewel house, where the king kept his personal treasures, and where Norris often worked, cataloging the gems and gold that Henry loved to hoard. Norris's control over this physical space was absolute. If Thomas Cromwell wanted to show the king a new draft of a law, he had to ask Norris to take it in. If an ambassador wanted to deliver a secret message from the emperor, he had to bribe Norris to leave the door ajar. This geography meant that Norris controlled the most valuable resource in the kingdom, the king's mood. He knew when the king was tired. He knew when the king had drunk too much the night before. He knew when the king was missing Anne Boleyn or angry with her. By controlling the timing of information, Norris controlled the outcome of policy. The day in the Privy Chamber began early, and it began with the ritual that gave Norris his title, the Groom of the Stool. We must strip away the modern embarrassment surrounding this. In the 16th century, the stool was a piece of furniture, a box covered in velvet and silk padded for comfort, containing a pewter or copper basin. It was a luxury item. Norris's duty was not merely to hand the king a towel. It was a ritual of purification and preparation. In the quiet of the morning, While the palace was still waking up, Norris was alone with Henry. As the king attended to his needs, he would talk. This is the psychological key. When we are vulnerable, we tend to be honest. Henry VIII, a man who had to wear a mask of majesty for 16 hours a day, could only take that mask off in the bathroom. It was here, in these unguarded moments, that Henry asked Norris for his true opinions. What do the people really say about the divorce? Is Cromwell becoming too arrogant? Does the Queen truly love me? Norris wasn't just a servant. He was a sounding board. He was the mirror in which the king checked his own soul. Following the ablutions came the ceremony of dressing. The king did not dress himself. Every piece of clothing, the hose, the doublet, the jerkin, the heavy fur-lined gown, was handed to him by the gentlemen of the privy chamber, led by Norris. This was a coordinated dance. Norris would warm the king's shirt by the fire. He would check the points, laces, to ensure they were strong. He would fasten the jewels onto the king's chest. This physical touch created a bond that was almost familial. In a world where touching the king was technically an assault, Norris touched him hundreds of times a day. He knew the king's body better than the queen did. He knew where the king was gaining weight. He knew which old jousting injuries were flaring up. This brings us to the darkest and most dangerous aspect of Norris's job, the management of the king's health. By 1536, Henry VIII was a crumbling monument. The golden youth of 1520 was gone. He was 44 years old, which was considered approaching old age in the Tudor era. He was gaining weight rapidly, but the real problem was his leg. During a joust years earlier, Henry had received a wound on his leg. It had ulcerated. It refused to heal. It was a constant weeping open sore that caused him agony, smelled terrible, and occasionally caused dangerous fevers, sepsis. The king was terrified of his own weakness. He went to great lengths to hide the extent of his infirmity from the court and the world. A king could not be seen as a cripple. Norris was the chief nurse. He helped the surgeons dress the wound. He saw the king in tears from the pain. He saw the king unable to walk. He managed the sorrows of the king's body. Furthermore, Norris knew the secrets of the king's sexual health. Henry VIII was obsessed with producing a male heir. When he failed to do so with Catherine of Aragon, and then failed with Anne Boleyn, he began to panic. He worried about his potency. There were whispers, never written down, but certainly spoken in the privy chamber, about the king's performance. Norris knew the truth. He knew if the king was struggling in the bedroom. This knowledge was radioactive. Thomas Cromwell knew that knowledge was power. But Norris had knowledge that could humiliate the king. As long as they were friends, Norris was the vault where these secrets were kept safe. But as soon as the king's paranoia took over, Norris transformed from a vault into a liability. A man who knows the king is impotent or weeping from a sore leg or terrified of death is a man who strips the king of his divinity. To restore his godhood, Henry had to destroy the witness to his humanity. This role also made Norris incredibly wealthy. The king, grateful for Norris's discretion, showered him with grants. He was given stewardships, manors, and monopolies. By the mid-1530s, Norris's annual income was estimated at over £1,300. To put that in perspective, a skilled laborer might earn £5 a year. Norris was earning a fortune that rivaled the oldest dukedoms in the land. He built a power base in Berkshire and Oxfordshire. He was effectively the king of the Thames Valley. But unlike the rapacious courtiers who would follow him, Norris had a reputation for generosity. He was known as a good landlord and a patron of the arts. If we want to understand why Henry Norris was so beloved and why his eventual execution was such a shock to the nation, we must look at his behavior during the fall of Cardinal Wolsey in 1529. Cardinal Wolsey had been the sun around which the English political solar system revolved. He was arrogant, ostentatious, and universally hated by the nobility. When he failed to secure Henry's annulment from Catherine of Aragon, the king turned on him. The fall of a Tudor favorite was usually a feeding frenzy. As soon as Wolsey's power cracked, his friends abandoned him. The Duke of Norfolk and the Duke of Suffolk, who had bowed to Wolsey for years, now practically lined up to spit on him. But Henry Norris did not participate. In October 1529, a pitiful scene played out. Wolsey, stripped of his power, was riding his mule into exile at Putney. He was broken, weeping, convinced he was about to be executed. Suddenly, a rider appeared on the horizon, galloping furiously toward the disgraced cardinal. It was Henry Norris. Wolsey's heart must have stopped. He likely assumed Norris was bringing the warrant for his arrest. Instead, Norris jumped from his horse and bowed low, showing the same respect to the ruined priest that he had shown to the Lord Chancellor. He handed Wolsey a gold ring from the king, a secret token of affection. Norris delivered a message. The king still loved him, but political pressure made this exile necessary. "Be of good cheer," Norris told him. The effect on Wolsey was electric. The records tell us that the fat, aging cardinal was so overcome with emotion that he practically fell off his mule. He knelt in the mud of the road and embraced Norris. He thanked God that there was still one decent man left in the king's service. Since Wolsey had been stripped of his wealth, he had nothing to give Norris as a reward, a standard custom for bringing good news. Desperate to show his gratitude, Wolsey tore a small gold cross from his neck. Inside was a splinter of the true cross. He gave it to Norris. Norris accepted it with reverence. He didn't mock the fallen man. He didn't gloat. He offered comfort. This incident defines Henry Norris. He was a man of old-world chivalry in a new world of cutthroat politics. It was this very quality, this tendency to offer comfort to the distressed, that would draw him into the orbit of the most dangerous woman in English history, Anne Boleyn. As the 1520s bled into the 1530s, the court underwent a seismic shift. The great matter, Henry's desire to divorce Catherine of Aragon and marry Anne Boleyn, consumed everything. The court split into factions: the Aragon faction, conservative, Catholic, traditional, and the Boleyn faction, radical, reformist, French-leaning. Henry Norris was squarely in the Boleyn camp. This wasn't just blind loyalty to the king. Norris was a genuine idealist. Like Anne Boleyn, he was drawn to the new learning. He was interested in religious reform. He supported the translation of the Bible into English. He, like Anne, wanted to break the corrupt power of the Catholic monasteries. Norris and Anne Boleyn were natural allies. They shared a sophisticated cosmopolitan outlook. They both spoke fluent French. They both despised the stodgy conservative nobles who looked down on them. As Anne rose, Norris rose with her. He facilitated her access to the king. When Anne needed to send a secret letter, Norris carried it. When Anne wanted to influence a political appointment, she worked through Norris. They became a team, the queen-in-waiting and the king's right hand. But their relationship was governed by the complex artificial rules of courtly love. In the Tudor court, courtly love was a game played by the aristocracy. It was a theatrical performance of romance. A male courtier was expected to pick a lady, often married, often of higher rank, and pledge his service to her. He would write her poems, wear her colors in the joust, and claim to be dying of a broken heart because of her beauty. And the lady? She was expected to play the mistress. She would be cold, then kind. She would rebuke him, then encourage him. Everyone knew it was a game. When a courtier said, "I am your servant and I love you," it was usually code for political alliance. It was a way of bonding. It It was flirtation as a social lubricant. Norris was a master of this game. He was charming, handsome, and widowed. He was the most eligible bachelor at court. Anne Boleyn enjoyed his company. She enjoyed his flattery. He was a safe outlet for her stress. He was the perfect knight to her fairy queen. But games are only fun when everyone agrees on the rules. And in the fevered atmosphere of 1536, the rules were dissolving. The court was becoming a paranoia factory. Thomas Cromwell, the blacksmith's son, who had risen to become the king's ruthless enforcer, was consolidating power. Cromwell and Norris were ostensibly on the same side, both reformers, both servants of the king. But there was a deep, festering rivalry between them. Norris had the king's ear, affection. Cromwell had the king's business, administration. Cromwell resented that he could never truly access the king's private thoughts because Norris stood at the door. Cromwell knew that as long as Norris was the groom of the stool, Cromwell's control over Henry would never be absolute. And then the tragedy began to take shape. In January 1536, Catherine of Aragon died. Anne Boleyn was finally the only queen. But mere weeks later, on the day of Catherine's funeral, Anne miscarried a male child. The king's grief turned instantly to cold rage. He had broken with the Pope, executed his friends, like Thomas More, and turned Europe against him, all for this marriage. And now he believed God had cursed it. Henry's eye began to wander to Jane Seymour. The atmosphere in the privy chamber changed. The king was no longer the golden prince. He was irritable, his leg ulcer causing him agony. Anne Boleyn could feel the ice cracking beneath her feet. She was terrified. She became hysterical, lashing out at her friends, desperate for reassurance. She needed her allies closer than ever. She needed Henry Norris. She began to lean on him too hard. The playful flirtation of courtly love began to take on a desperate, frantic edge. She needed to know he was still loyal. She needed to know he would protect her if the king turned against her. In April 1536, the trap was set. It wasn't a grand conspiracy at first. It was a convergence of a paranoid king, a ruthless minister, Cromwell, and a desperate queen. And standing in the middle of this deadly triangle, blind to the danger, was the honorable, loyal, and doomed Sir Henry Norris. The tragedy of Henry Norris is that his fall did not begin with a grand act of treason, but with a momentary lapse in social etiquette during a conversation that should have been private. It was Sunday, April 30th. The setting was the Queen's chambers at Greenwich Palace. The court was preparing for the May Day celebrations, but the mood in Anne's circle was tense. Norris was there, fulfilling his duties as a courtier. He was a widower, and for some time there had been talk of a marriage between him and Madge Shelton, the Queen's cousin and lady-in-waiting. It was a sensible match, one that would have cemented Norris's tie to the Boleyn family. But Norris had been dragging his feet. He hadn't proposed. He hadn't moved the negotiations forward. Anne Boleyn, her nerves frayed and looking for a fight, cornered him. She was in a mood to pick at scabs. She asked him why he hadn't married Madge yet. Norris, the ultimate diplomat, gave a vague, polite answer. He said he would tarry a time. He was waiting. Perhaps he was enjoying his bachelorhood. Perhaps he sensed the political winds were changing and didn't want to tie himself too closely to a sinking ship. Anne was stung. In her high-strung state, she interpreted his hesitation as a personal slight. She pushed him. She teased him, suggesting that perhaps he wasn't marrying Madge because he was waiting for something better. "You look for dead men's shoes," she snapped, "for if aught came to the king but good, you would look to have me." The room must have gone ice cold. In the 21st century, this sounds like a melodramatic retort. In 1536, it was a death sentence. Under the Treason Act of 1534, it was high treason to compass or imagine the king's death. To speak of the king dying was to wish for it. For the queen to suggest that her husband's best friend was waiting for him to die so he could marry the queen himself was not just a flirtatious joke, it was a verbalization of a coup. It implied they had discussed the king's death. It implied a future without Henry. Norris, a man who knew the law intimately, realized instantly that Anne had just handed their enemies a loaded gun. He panicked. The smooth, calm groom of the Stool vanished, replaced by a terrified subject. He immediately rebuked the queen. He told her that if he had any such thoughts, he would rather his head be cut off. It was a violent, defensive reaction. Anne, realizing she had gone too far, tried to walk it back, but the damage was done. She was so rattled by the exchange that she ordered Norris to go to her almoner, chaplain, and swear on his oath that she was a good woman. She was trying to create a record of her innocence before the accusation could spread. But walls in Tudor palaces were made of paper and ears. Cromwell's spies were everywhere. Within hours, the conversation was reported to Thomas Cromwell. Cromwell must have smiled. He didn't need proof of sexual intercourse. He didn't need dirty sheets. He had the queen and the king's chief gentleman discussing the king's death. That was enough. The sun rose on May 1st, 1536, over a court that was pretending everything was normal. It was May Day, the traditional festival of spring, youth, and renewal. A grand tournament was held at Greenwich. The tilt yard was packed with spectators. The banners waved, the trumpets blared, and the king sat in the royal box, Queen Anne beside him. To the casual observer, they were the majestic couple presiding over their kingdom. But beneath the velvet, the king was simmering. We know now that earlier that day, or perhaps late the night before, Cromwell had presented the king with the first piece of the puzzle, the confession of Mark Smeaton. Smeaton, a low-born musician, had been arrested and interrogated, likely tortured, at Cromwell's house. He had cracked. He had confessed to being the Queen's lover, but Henry VIII wasn't satisfied with just a musician. A queen doesn't betray a king for a lute player. The king's paranoia demanded a bigger betrayal. Down in the lists, Sir Henry Norris was preparing to ride. He was one of the challengers, leading the king's team. He was clad in armor, mounted on a powerful destrier. He was the picture of chivalric perfection. As he dipped his lance to the royal box, he was saluting a man who was already deciding whether to kill him. The joust began. Norris rode well. The crowd cheered. The violence of the sport, the shattering of lances, the thunder of hooves, masked the political violence about to be unleashed. Then abruptly, it ended. Before the tournament was finished, the king stood up. His face was thunderous. He did not wait for the final ceremonies. He did not say goodbye to the queen. He simply turned and left the box. Anne must have watched him go with a sinking heart. She would never see him again. The king ordered his horse. He was riding to Westminster immediately, and he issued a command that sent a shock wave through the retinue. Sir Henry Norris was to ride with him. The journey from Greenwich to Westminster is not long, but for Henry Norris, it was the longest ride of his life. This journey is one of the most intimate and devastating scenes in the history of the English monarchy. It was just the two of them, perhaps with guards at a respectful distance. Two men who had known each other for 20 years. Two men who had shared secrets, money, and laughter. Henry VIII confronted Norris. He didn't scream. He bargained. The king told Norris what he knew. He told him about Smeaton's confession. He told him about the rumors. And then he made Norris an extraordinary offer. Henry VIII claimed he loved Norris. He valued his service. And because of that love, he was willing to make a deal. If Norris would confess, if he would admit to the affair with Anne Boleyn, The king promised to spare his life. Think about the psychology of this offer. The king was desperate for validation. He needed his best friend to confirm his paranoia. If Norris confessed, it would justify everything Henry wanted to do. It would prove that Anne was a whore, that Henry was the victim, and that the marriage could be dissolved guilt-free. The king was effectively saying, "Lie for me, and I will let you live. Destroy her, and I will save you." Most men would have taken the deal. Norris was wealthy. He had children to protect. All he had to do was nod his head. All he had to do was say, "Yes, Your Majesty. She seduced me." He would have been banished, disgraced, but he would have kept his head. But Henry Norris was bound by a code that the king had long ago abandoned. He was a gentleman. Norris looked at the king and refused. He denied the charges utterly. His reported words echo through the centuries. "I would die 1,000 deaths rather than ruin an innocent person." He not only asserted his own innocence, but he also defended Anne. He told the king that in his conscience he believed the queen to be innocent. This was the breaking point. The king's offer of mercy was conditional on Norris's submission. When Norris refused to validate the king's delusion, the king's love turned instantly to hatred. Henry VIII could not tolerate a man who made him feel morally inferior. If Norris was innocent, then Henry was a tyrant. Therefore, Norris had to be guilty. By the time they reached Westminster, the friendship was dead. Norris was arrested on arrival and taken straight to the Tower of London. The Tower of London was the grim processing center for the king's enemies. Norris was not thrown into a dungeon initially. As a man of high rank, he was likely kept in relatively comfortable lodgings. But the comfort was an illusion. He was cut off from the world. He had no lawyer. He had no contact with his family. And his interrogator was Thomas Cromwell. Cromwell visited Norris in the Tower. The dynamic between these two men is fascinating. They were the two pillars of the state, the administrator and the courtier. Cromwell respected Norris's power, but he needed him gone. We can imagine the interrogation. Cromwell would have been calm, reasonable. He would have pointed out that Smeaton had already confessed. He would have pointed out that the king was determined. He likely repeated the king's offer, "Confess, and you might still save your lands for your children." But Norris held firm. He knew that Mark Smeaton had likely been tortured, rack or thumbscrews. A confession obtained under torture was worthless to a man of honor. Norris's refusal to confess was a massive problem for Cromwell. Smeaton was a low-born nobody. His word against a queen was weak. Cromwell needed a nobleman, a credible witness to admit guilt. He needed Norris to legitimize the entire trial, but Norris wouldn't break. He maintained that the queen was innocent and that he was innocent. Meanwhile, the net was widening. Cromwell was not content with just Norris and Smeaton. To make the conspiracy look like a grand debauchery, he needed more bodies. He turned his gaze to Sir Francis Weston, arrested on May 4th. A young, arrogant, and handsome gentleman of the Privy Chamber, Weston had been a favorite of the king and his tennis partner. Yet his crime was simply flirting too boldly within the Queen's inner circle. Next came Sir William Brereton, a powerful magnate from Cheshire. Then came the final devastating blow, the arrest of George Boleyn, Lord Rochford, the Queen's own brother. The accusation leveled against him was the most horrific of all: incest. While Norris sat in the Tower, Cromwell's legal team was drafting the indictment. On May 10th and 11th, grand juries were summoned to rule on whether there was enough evidence to go to trial. This was a formality. The juries were packed with men who owed their careers to Cromwell or who were terrified of the king. They returned a true bill. The trial was set. For Henry Norris, the realization must have been settling in. He wasn't going to talk his way out of this. The king, the man he had served for 20 years, the man whose secrets he had kept, whose debts he had paid, whose tears he had dried, had decided to kill him. On the morning of Friday, May 12, 1536, Sir Henry Norris was led from the Tower of London to Westminster Hall. He traveled by barge, the dark waters of the Thames lapping against the hull, a river he had traveled 1,000 times in luxury with the king, now his road to judgment. Westminster Hall was the heart of English justice. It is a cavernous, terrifying space with a soaring hammer-beam roof that makes human beings feel like insects. On this day it was packed. The galleries were overflowing with courtiers, merchants, and the curious public. They had come to see the unimaginable, the king's other self on trial for treason. The atmosphere was not one of justice, it was one of political theater. Everyone in that room knew the script. The king wanted a divorce from Anne Boleyn. To get it, he needed her to be a monster, and to make her a monster, her friends had to be monsters too. Norris stood at the bar, flanked by the 3 men who shared his grim fate. Beside him was Sir Francis Weston, the young, foolish favorite who had flown too close to the sun, standing alongside Sir William Brereton, the hard-bitten magnate from the wild Welsh marches. Completing their doomed quartet was Mark Smeaton, the low-born musician, the only one among them who had broken under pressure and confessed. The contrast between the men was stark. Smeaton was likely broken, trembling, perhaps showing signs of the torture he had endured. Norris, Weston, and Brereton, gentlemen all, stood tall. They were not guilty. They were innocent men in a room designed to kill them. If Norris had any hope of a fair trial, it evaporated when he looked at the jury. In a modern trial, we expect a jury of impartial peers. In 1536, the jury was a weapon. The panel consisted of 12 knights and esquires, but they were not random choices. They were handpicked by Thomas Cromwell and the king's allies. Many of them had personal grudges against the Boleyn faction. Others were simply terrified. They knew that if they returned a verdict of not guilty, they themselves might be the next ones standing in the dock. The king's will was law, and the king's will was that Norris must die. Presiding over the court was the Duke of Norfolk, Thomas Howard. He was Anne Boleyn's uncle, but he hated her. He was a conservative, old-school aristocrat who viewed men like Norris, new men risen from the gentry, with contempt. Norfolk was there to ensure the butcher's work was done efficiently. The charges were read aloud. The Crown prosecutor claimed that Henry Norris had traitorously committed adultery with the Queen. The indictment was specific. It accused Henry Norris of sleeping with the Queen on October 6, 1533, and again on October 12, 1533, at Westminster. Norris listened to these charges with what we can assume was a mixture of horror and resignation. He had no counsel. He had no access to his own records. He could not call witnesses. When he tried to speak to deny the charges, he was fighting against the full weight of the state. He maintained that the Queen was innocent and that he was innocent. But the most damaging witness was standing right next to him. Mark Smeaton, the musician, pleaded, guilty. This was the hammer blow. Smeaton's confession, yes, I did it, tainted everyone else. The jury could look at Smeaton and say, well, one of them admitted it, so the conspiracy must be real. Smeaton's weakness doomed Norris's strength. The jury did not deliberate for long. There was no need. To acquit Norris would be to accuse the king of being a liar. The foreman stood up. The verdict for Henry Norris, guilty. The verdict for Weston, guilty. The verdict for Brereton, guilty. The verdict for Smeaton, guilty. Then came the sentencing. The Duke of Norfolk, representing the king, pronounced the judgment. It was the standard sentence for high treason. and it is the most horrific punishment in English law, to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. Norris was condemned to face the full brutality of a traitor's death. He was to be dragged upon a wooden hurdle through the streets of London to Tyburn, where he would be hanged by the neck only to be cut down while still alive and conscious. In a final act of gruesome theater, his belly was to be sliced open and his entrails burned before his very eyes, after which his body would be severed into quarters and displayed upon the city gates as a grim warning. This was the king's final message to his beloved friend. The man who had held the king's towels, who had soothed the king's headaches, was sentenced to be butchered like livestock. However, in a final twist of the knife, the king granted mercy. Because Norris was of noble stock and a knight of the body, the sentence was commuted. He would not be quartered. He would be beheaded. It was a small mercy, but in the terrifying world of the Tudors, a clean death was a prize worth praying for. Norris was taken back to the Tower. He had 5 days left to live. The psychological pressure during these final days was immense. Thomas Cromwell and his agents continued to press the condemned men. They desperately wanted a confession. Even after the verdict, a confession from Norris would have been political gold. It would have silenced all the doubters in Europe who were already whispering that the king was murdering his wife to marry Jane Seymour. Norris was likely visited by the royal chaplain. He was urged to clear his conscience. In the religious mindset of the 16th century, dying with a lie on your lips put your immortal soul in peril, but Norris remained immovable. This is the most heroic part of his story. He knew he was going to die. He had nothing left to gain from the king, yet he refused to validate the king's lie. He refused to slander Anne Boleyn. He prepared his soul. He worried about his creditors. Norris was a man of honor, and even in death he wanted to ensure his debts were paid. He worried about his son, Henry Norris the Younger, who was now the son of a traitor, stripped of his inheritance. Wednesday, May 17th, Tower Hill. Tower Hill is a raised area just outside the walls of the Tower of London. It was the public stage for high-status executions. On this morning, a massive crowd had gathered. They were there to see the blood of the king's favorites. The scaffold was erected high above the crowd, draped in black. Straw was scattered on the floor to soak up the blood. Norris was led out. He was dressed well, likely in a gown of black velvet. He walked with dignity. He was the most senior of the condemned men, the father of the privy chamber, and the others looked to him for cues on how to die. He climbed the steps. The executioner knelt and asked for forgiveness, a custom of the time. Norris forgave him and likely gave him a few gold coins, the traditional tip to ensure a sharp axe and a clean swing. Then came the moment of the speech. We must understand the scaffold speech. It was a genre of performance art. You were not allowed to claim you were innocent. If you claimed innocence on the scaffold, the king might get angry and revoke the pardon for your family's property. To save your children, you had to play along. You had to say, I am a sinner. I deserve to die. God save the king. Norris walked this tightrope brilliantly. He faced the crowd. He did not confess to adultery. He did not confess to treason. He simply said that he had been judged by the law and he was there to suffer the penalty of the law. He asked the people to pray for the king. He asked them to pray for his soul. It was a non-denial denial. He submitted to the authority of the king, but he did not admit to the crime. He maintained his code of silence to the very end. He removed his gown and doublet. He unbuttoned the collar of his shirt. The crowd fell silent. Sir Henry Norris, the man who had controlled the Tudor court, the man who had been the gatekeeper to the greatest monarch in Europe, knelt in the straw. He placed his neck on the block. He commended his spirit to God. The axe rose. It fell. And with one blow, The king's other self was gone. The aftermath of the execution was swift and brutal. The bodies of Norris, Weston, Brereton, and Smeaton were stripped. Their heads were not spiked on London Bridge, another mercy granted to them. They were gathered up. There is a haunting tradition that they were buried in the graveyard of the chapel of St. Peter at Vincula, within the Tower walls. This is the saddest patch of earth in England, where queens and saints and traitors lie mixed together without monuments. But the legend of Ockwell's Manor persists. The locals in Berkshire whispered for centuries that Norris's body was secretly transported home by loyal servants under the cover of darkness. They say he was buried in the family crypt, reunited with his ancestors. Whether true or not, the story reflects the deep respect Norris commanded. He was not remembered as a traitor by those who knew him. He was remembered as a martyr to a tyrant's ego. Back at court, Henry VIII did what he did best. He rewrote history. He immediately seized Norris's offices. The position of Groom of the Stool, that golden ticket, was given to Sir Thomas Heneage. The king took Norris's houses. He took his plate. He took his horses. Henry VIII erased Henry Norris. He never spoke his name again. It was as if the 20 years of friendship, the intimate mornings in the privy chamber, the shared jokes, the shared secrets, none of it had ever happened. The king washed his hands of the blood and turned his face toward his marriage to Jane Seymour, which took place just 13 days later. But while the king could kill the man, he couldn't kill the truth. Norris's refusal to confess remained a stubborn stain on the king's conscience. It was the silence that roared. By refusing to give the king the lie he wanted, Norris had denied Henry the one thing he craved most: moral justification. The king had his divorce, he had his new wife, but he had lost the only man who had ever truly been his friend. And in the shadows, a young boy was watching. Henry Norris the younger, now an orphan of a traitor, was growing up. He would carry the weight of his father's name through the dark years ahead. He would wait for the wheel of fortune to turn, and when the daughter of Anne Boleyn finally took the throne, the ghost of Henry Norris would rise again. The executioner's work was done, and the king had his blood sacrifice. In the immediate aftermath, Henry VIII believed he had solved his problem. The man who knew too much was silenced. But while heads can be severed, loyalties are harder to kill. The king moved aggressively to bury the memory of Henry Norris, assuming that his other self would fade into historical oblivion. He was wrong. The axe had ended a life, but it had started a legacy that the king could not control. When the axe fell on Tower Hill on May 17th, 1536, it did more than end a life. It shattered the ecosystem of the English court. For nearly 2 decades, Sir Henry Norris had been the sun around which the privy chamber orbited. He was the filter, the gatekeeper, the king's other self. When he was removed, a vacuum was created, a void that Henry VIII rushed to fill with a desperation that betrayed his guilt. The king did not mourn. To mourn would be to admit loss, and to admit loss would be to question the justice of the execution. Instead, Henry VIII engaged in an aggressive act of psychological erasure. He treated Henry Norris not as a dead friend, but as a failed appliance that had been discarded. Within hours of the execution, the king was already distributing the spoils. The physical erasure was just as swift. Norris's apartments at Hampton Court and Greenwich were cleared out. His furniture, his tapestries, his plate, all seized by the crown. The king, in a petty display of dominance, even took some of Norris's horses for his own stables. Every time Henry rode one of those horses, did he think of the man who had trained it? We will never know. The king had a terrifying capacity to compartmentalize his conscience. But while the king could confiscate property, he could not confiscate the whispers. The court was in shock. Ambassadors wrote home in disbelief. The imperial ambassador, Eustace Chapuis, who had hated the Boleyn faction, expressed surprise at Norris's fall. He knew Norris to be a man of prudence and honor. If Norris was a traitor, then no one was safe. While the court moved on to the wedding preparations for Jane Seymour, the Norris family was left to pick up the pieces of a shattered dynasty. Norris's wife, Mary Fiennes, had died years before the tragedy, around 1531. This meant that his children were now orphans. The most important of these was his eldest son, also named Henry Norris, born around 1525. Imagine the position of this 11-year-old boy. One day, he is the son of the most powerful commoner in England, heir to a vast fortune, destined for greatness. The next day, his father is a convicted traitor, his blood tainted, meaning he could not inherit titles, and his family name is synonymous with the worst crime imaginable, sleeping with the Queen. However, the Norris family had a secret weapon. They were liked, unlike the Boleyns, who were despised for their arrogance. Sir Henry Norris had been universally respected for his kindness. This bank account of goodwill paid dividends after his death. The king, perhaps feeling a flicker of shame, did not leave the children destitute. He allowed the Norris family to keep some of their lands. Young Henry Norris was taken in by his uncle, Sir John Norris. He was raised quietly in the country, far away from the toxic atmosphere of the court. He grew up in the shadows of Ockwell's Manor and Rycote. These were the silent years. For the remainder of Henry VIII's reign, until 1547, the name Norris was spoken in hushed tones. The young Henry learned the most valuable lesson a Tudor survivor could learn: invisibility. He did not seek attention. He did not lobby for his father's restoration. He waited. He watched as the men who killed his father turned on each other. He watched Thomas Cromwell, the architect of the plot, lose his own head in 1540, a grim poetic justice. He watched the Duke of Norfolk narrowly escape execution. He watched the king rot from the inside out, dying a bloated, terrifying wreck in 1547. With the old tyrant dead, the ice began to thaw. But the true restoration of the Norris name would have to wait for a specific miracle. It would have to wait for the daughter of the woman his father died for. In 1558, Mary I, Bloody Mary, died, and Elizabeth I ascended the throne. This was the moment the world turned upside down. Elizabeth was the daughter of Anne Boleyn. For her entire life, she had been told her mother was a whore and a traitor. But Elizabeth knew the truth. She knew that her mother had been the victim of a judicial murder, and she remembered the men who had died with her. Elizabeth, they had a long memory. She knew that when the king offered Henry Norris his life in exchange for a confession, Norris had refused. He had protected her mother's reputation with his dying breath. If Norris had confessed, Elizabeth's legitimacy would have been destroyed forever. She owed her crown in part to Henry Norris's silence. As soon as she became queen, she sent for the Norris family. The meeting between Queen Elizabeth I and Henry Norris the Younger must have been electric. She looked at him and saw the son of the martyr. He looked at her and saw the living vindication of his father's sacrifice. Elizabeth did not hold back. She restored the Norris family to full blood. She returned their confiscated lands. But she went much further. She knighted Henry Norris. She made him Baron Norreys of Rycote. She brought him into the inner circle of the Elizabethan court. She gave him the nickname My Own Crow, a play on the Black Norris crest, or perhaps his dark hair, a term of endearment that signaled to everyone, this man is untouchable. In 1566, Elizabeth appointed Henry Norris, now Baron Norris, as her ambassador to France. The symbolism was staggering. His father, Sir Henry Norris, had been the great Francophile of Henry VIII's court. He had loved French culture, acted as the liaison to the French ambassadors, and had been destroyed by a coup that sought to break the French alliance. Now his son returned to Paris as the voice of England. Baron Norris served as ambassador for 4 difficult years, 1566 to 1570. These were the years of the French Wars of Religion. It was a dangerous, complex assignment requiring nerves of steel, the same nerves his father had shown in the Privy Chamber. Norris performed admirably. He was not a flashy courtier like his father. He was a serious, somewhat somber statesman. He had lived through the trauma of 1536, and it had left him with a permanent gravity. But his service cemented the Norris family as a pillar of the Elizabethan state. The family seat, Rycote Palace in Oxfordshire, became a symbol of this resurrection. Elizabeth I visited Rycote multiple times. She treated it as a second home. There's a touching story about the relationship between the Queen and the Norris family. Baron Norris and his wife, Marjorie Williams, had 6 sons. They were a brood of fighting men serving as soldiers in Ireland and the Netherlands. They were known as the Norris brood. As the wars took their toll, the sons began to die in service to the Queen. Each time a son died, Elizabeth would write a personal letter of condolence to Lady Norris. She called her "my own dear Crow." Her letters were not the formal missives of a monarch. They were the letters of a woman sharing the grief of a family she loved. When one of the sons, Sir John Norris, a famous general, died, the Queen was so distraught she could barely write. The bond between the House of Tudor and the House of Norris, severed by the axe in 1536, had been healed by the daughter of Anne Boleyn. We have walked the floorboards of the Privy Chamber and felt the suffocating pressure of life alongside a tyrant. We have seen how the very nature of Norris's duties made him both indispensable and doomed. But now, we must strip away the emotion and the atmosphere. We must step out of the 16th century and look at the cold, hard facts with modern eyes. If we were to convene a court today, armed with the forensic tools of the historian, does the case against Henry Norris stand up? It is time to subject the king's justice to the verdict of the centuries. If Sir Henry Norris were tried in a modern court of law, or even a fair court of the 18th century, the case against him would not just fail, it would be thrown out by the judge before the jury was even seated. The judicial murder of Norris is one of the most transparent frame-ups in legal history. And to understand the depth of the tragedy, we must act as forensic historians and dissect the evidence that sent him to the block. The Crown's case rested entirely on the indictment. This document, preserved in the National Archives, lists specific dates and locations where the alleged adulteries took place. At the time, Norris had no access to this document to prepare a defense. But today, we can cross-reference these dates with the royal itinerary, the daily log of where the king and queen were located, and the household accounts. The results are damning for the prosecution, revealing a case built on chronological impossibilities. The indictment accuses Henry Norris of sleeping with the Queen at Westminster on October 6th and 12th, 1533, yet this timeline is fabricated. On those specific dates, Anne was miles away at Greenwich Palace, still adhering to the strict religious protocol of confinement following the birth of Princess Elizabeth, a period during which no man was permitted near her chambers. While Anne was locked away, Norris was likely attending the king at Westminster. Furthermore, the allegations concerning November 1535 at Hampton Court are equally implausible. Although the Queen was present at the palace, the reality of royal life offered no secrecy. She was surrounded 24 hours a day by her ladies-in-waiting, leaving absolutely no privacy for an illicit liaison. Why were these specific dates chosen? It appears Thomas Cromwell's clerks simply picked dates when the court was in session, without checking the specific movements of the Queen. They were sloppy. They knew they didn't need to be accurate. They only needed to be lethal. The jury was not there to weigh facts. They were there to ratify the king's will. If Norris was innocent, why did he have to die? Why couldn't Cromwell just target the musician Smeaton and be done with it? The answer lies in the theory of the factional coup. Thomas Cromwell was a brilliant political chess player. He didn't just want to remove Anne Boleyn. He wanted to destroy her entire political machine. Anne was not just a wife. She was the leader of a political party. She controlled patronage. She influenced religious policy, and her enforcers were the gentlemen of the Privy Chamber, specifically Henry Norris, Francis Weston, and William Brereton. Together, these men formed a protective blockade around the king, effectively preventing Cromwell from exercising total control. Henry Norris acted as the gatekeeper to the king's private time, while Francis Weston enjoyed privileged intimacy as the monarch's favorite playboy. Rounding out this circle was William Brereton, a powerful magnate in the Marches, who had previously clashed with Cromwell over matters of jurisdiction. By lumping them all together in a great conspiracy, Cromwell achieved a clean sweep. He decapitated the Boleyn faction in a single weekend. He removed the Queen, her brother, George Boleyn, and her three most powerful male allies. It was efficient, it was ruthless, and it left Cromwell as the undisputed master of the state, at least until the king turned on him 4 years later. There is a darker, more Freudian interpretation of why Henry VIII killed Henry Norris. It wasn't just about politics, it was about masculine insecurity. By 1536, Henry VIII was a man painfully aware of his own physical decay. At 44, he was balding, rapidly gaining weight, unable to joust, and plagued by intermittent impotence. This decline stood in brutal contrast to the men he chose to destroy, as each victim seemed to reflect a specific vitality the king had lost. He executed Henry Norris, the fit and active perfect gentleman, and Francis Weston, the court's acclaimed young athlete and tennis player. He silenced Mark Smeaton, a musician possessing the very talent Henry prided himself on, and condemned George Boleyn, who remained handsome, witty, and intelligent. In extinguishing these men, Henry was not merely removing rivals, but crushing the living reminders of his own vanished youth and potency. These men represented everything Henry used to be, but was no longer. They were a mirror of his lost youth. When Cromwell whispered that Anne Boleyn had slept with these men, it triggered a primal rage in the king. It wasn't just betrayal, it was replacement. The idea that Anne preferred these younger, fitter, or more capable men drove the king to a murderous frenzy. He didn't just want them dead, he wanted them obliterated. He was killing his own inadequacy. Why does Sir Henry Norris matter today? Why should we care about a courtier who died 500 years ago? He matters because he represents a moral choice that is timeless. We live in an age of spin, of plea bargains, of public apologies for things people didn't do just to save their careers. We understand the concept of selling out to survive. Henry Norris had the ultimate sell-out option. He was offered life. He was offered a future. All he had to do was tell one lie. And that lie would have been easy to tell because everyone else was telling it. The king wanted it. The minister wanted it. The outcome was inevitable anyway. But Norris said no. He chose truth over life. He chose his reputation over his breath. I would die 1,000 deaths rather than ruin an innocent person. In the sordid, blood-soaked history of the Tudor court, where men betrayed their brothers and wives betrayed their husbands, Henry Norris stands as a singular beacon of integrity. He was the king's other self, but in the end he proved to be the better man. The king had the crown, but Norris had the character. His death was a tragedy, but his life was a triumph. He showed that even in the face of absolute tyranny, the human conscience is the one territory that cannot be conquered.